Hello, everybody. Today is September 2022, and I'm here for a special edition of the coronavirus conversation we do weekly on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, you name it. And I'm honored and privileged to have as a guest with me Dr. Meryl Nass. She's an internist of long standing, and she's, I believe, been in the profession 40 years, up in Maine, state of Maine, for 25 years. And I met her peripherally as a member of the audience at a Panda group. It's pandata.org, which is a wonderful organization. You should go check it out, donate, so forth, pandata.org, helping keep the world free from somewhat irrelevant and meretricious lockdowns and whatnot. Anyway, she presented a lecture on the virus that we all come to know and love and hate and so forth. And while she was doing that, I looked up her name and saw that she had been suspended by the state of Maine, and we're going to discuss some of those aspects. And they wanted to get a neuropsych evaluation. My own personal vibe is that she's a warm, caring, loving, intelligent, sensitive, and knowledgeable physician. I would go see her as a patient if she were up and around and in my area and so forth. And maybe you could do your own neuropsych evaluation of Dr. Nass and or the Board of Registration in Medicine in Maine as a result. So I think we're going to maybe discuss some of the issues of what constitutes free speech and where Dr. Nass went wrong, as it were, or went wrong in the eyes of the board in Maine. Please correct me for my inconsistencies or errors in your bio or whatever, but welcome aboard, Dr. Nass.
Hi, thanks for inviting me, Randall.
So just to start, what kind of tickled the Board of Registration in Maine in medicine the wrong way?
Well, I think there were several things happening at the same time. So the board issued a warning to doctors in the early fall of last year that they would be potentially investigated and punished for spreading misinformation about COVID. And it turned out that the chairperson of the board, who's an ophthalmologist in Maine, is on the board of directors of the Federation of State Medical Boards, which had issued this warning to doctors. And the Federation is actually a nonprofit. It has no regulatory authority. But for some reason, the reason isn't clear, presumably some money changed hands, they decided to get on this bandwagon of going after doctors who said mean things about the vaccines or good things about ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, or challenge the predominant government narrative on how to deal with COVID. And
I'm sorry.
No, so anyway, they sent out this memo, and I immediately wrote to them and I said, I'd like, you're going to go after doctors for misinformation. I'd like the definition of misinformation.
That was my question I was about to ask.
And then I said, and I'd like to know your statutory authority to go after it. We do have a First Amendment. And then I had actually given a talk to the Education Committee of the Legislature of New Hampshire in November. And so a few days later, I sent that to them. And I said, can you please tell me which of these things I stated is misinformation, if any? Mm-hmm. And I also sent them a very long, wonderful 48-page opinion by the Attorney General of Nebraska, which I had helped advise the Attorney General's office in Nebraska, which explains why all medical professionals, including pharmacists, are free to dispense and prescribe ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, and how none of the three federal agencies, the NIH, FDA, and CDC, as well as the WHO, had put forward any arguments that made any sense against these drugs. So it tore up the alleged arguments that were being used. It did a literature review and said, obviously we're giving our medical professionals safe harbor to use these drugs. And that came out on October 15th of last year. So I'd provided all that to the board, and they thought I was snarky, of course, and they probably were aware that I did interviews and podcasts, and I have a blog, and I have a Substack,
Mhm.
and anyway, and I work for Children's Health Defense. So what was interesting was in October, November, they got 2 complaints about me from complete strangers. People that said, I've never met Dr. Nass. I don't know any of her patients. I saw something on the internet and I didn't like it, and you should investigate her. And neither one of them actually said what it was that was misinformation or wrong or any of that.
Wow.
And the board then attempted, they knew, one of the lawyers, one of the assistant attorney generals who works for the board knew that you can't go after a doctor for, we don't like what she said.
Well, not
And
only that, they have no standing, as it were. Usually cases have to have standing. Something happened to me.
exactly. Well, this board didn't care about that. So they begged these strangers to give us a specific, what did she say that was wrong or incorrect? And neither one did. But one of them, who was probably, paid off by some federal agency, transcribed one of my interviews and handed that to the board. And the other one found some Twitter tweets.
One of your public interviews, not a
Public
medical
interview, found it on the internet.
not a doctor-patient interview.
No, and spent, probably most of the weekend transcribing it, or someone was paid to
Somebody
transcribe
did.
it.
Mhm.
And so he provided a transcript to the board, and the other person gave some tweets to the board. And so then they issued me a letter saying, we're investigating you and please defend yourself. And I said, what's the complaint? I don't think you have a complaint. You asked me to defend against everything I've ever said. And so they never would specify what a complaint, but they knew they needed to get a complaint. So then suddenly, now remember, in 41 years of medical practice, I've never had a single patient complaint. I had the son of one patient once complained to the board, and after they'd investigated that, which was about 15 years ago, he apologized to me that he hadn't understood that I was actually treating his mother very correctly. That's the only complaint I've ever gotten. No malpractice cases, nothing. And so suddenly, a doctor and a midwife complain, oh, Dr. Nass treated a patient with ivermectin. Dr. Nass treated a patient with hydroxychloroquine.
Well, those are absurdities. Just for our audience, I would spend a minute. This is, one of my pet peeves. There are many, many medications that doctors have long been free to use, off-label. Viagra, which, as a side note, I think had it been invented, 50 years earlier, might have prevented World War II and many other wars. Because of getting rid of some male frustrations and so forth. But Viagra was an anti-anginal pill, a heart pill, basically, to keep kind of hearts quiet and unheart attackable, and was only secondarily found to help with erections. Propecia helps grow men's hair, and minoxidil, Rogaine, which helps grow men and women's hair, were offshoots of prostate and blood pressure medications, respectively. Aspirin used for stroke as a secondary usage. So there have always been cases where doctors have forged ahead when there are other uses for medication to go ahead and try them. And in the year 2020, absent a vaccine, where we're just saying hunkered down, many places on earth locked down, there was very little rationale not to try a medication that was already deemed safe and effective for other uses. HCQ and ivermectin were both FDA approved, and they're generic, and they're had their uses. And I've never come down firmly on whether they are efficacious for COVID-19, and I'm not here to really adjudicate that. But those medications were out and about, and there's no reason really not to have been able to try them along the way. And doctors always have had off-label uses. Frankly, the largest probably prescribed medicine in the country, not for chronic use, is penicillin or analogs, amoxicillin, stuff like that, when people come in for the cold. Doctors always know the common cold is not treated medically, but people want something. They want an antibiotic. So doctors oftentimes, will bow to their desires and write amoxicillin or, cephalosporin or whatever, an antibiotic. And those are always not effective. But nobody's come down with these draconian rules or statutes about you cannot write an antibiotic for a virus. And effectively, ivermectin is an antibiotic of sorts. Anyway, I apologize for that little digression. But do you have any thoughts about that? And what were your comments to them at the time?
Well, at that point, once they got these two complaints about me using the drugs, they said, "Okay, now we can go after her." And so they decided, even though there was no statutory authority to do this, they decided to immediately suspend me and told my attorney this ahead of time, before they'd had a meeting about me. And so the meeting was scheduled for January 11th, and the attorney told me 4 days earlier, on the Friday afternoon, "Well, I think they're going to suspend your license at the meeting." So I put it up on my blog, and apparently, either I wasn't supposed to be told or I wasn't supposed to put it on my blog, but I didn't know that. And so she resigned from my case the night before that.
The attorney did?
Yeah, the attorney did.
Your attorney?
Yeah, my first attorney. I've had several. And so, of course, they charge anyway, but she resigned from the case, and which was a good thing, because I don't think she was going to do a good job of defending me.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a self-pronouncement. It's like, kind of picking the, self-segregation. She's deciding for you that she's not necessarily in your favor or competent.
Right. She's not on my side. And then I had a couple of other attorneys who resigned from my case. And now I have a really good attorney.
Okay. Can I just interject? Unfortunately, I've had some experience with going against the Board of Registration in Medicine in Massachusetts. And I'll just say, broadly speaking, there are two types of attorneys working for the physicians. Those who want to keep patients coming in and don't want to stick their heads out too far in any kind of case such as yours, which might be a First Amendment case, and those who are a little bit, say, braver. And oftentimes you have to go outside of the standard association of board-related, medical board defendant attorneys. And I don't know if you found that as to be the case or not.
I did. I think there's a problem, because if you use an attorney who just does board cases all the time, and that person's in your state, they have to stay on the good side of the boards.
Exactly.
Right?
That's to my point, precisely.
And so they often don't really fight for the client, although they know the minutia of board procedures, which are a little different than other legal procedures.
Yeah. So I've been on both sides of this in a sense. I had a case. I don't want to spend time on me, but I had kind of an aggrandized case by a narcotic addict complaint that snowballed in something, and I was suspended in 2014. At the time, I had kind of my regular GP attorney, a wonderful man, do the case, but there were a lot of ins and outs of the board that he didn't know. On the other hand, he was brave, and he said what he thought, and fought and fought and fought. Later on, we wound up getting advice from kind of the in-house, knowledgeable board-related attorneys, but a lot of them won't do the cases that need to be done. And so it's kind of you have to pick your poison, as it were. And it's a sadness, because the bureaucracy is arcane, and it has its own, kind of Kafka-esque or Byzantine rules. And there are attorneys who clearly know this stuff, and attorneys who don't. So my fine, excellent attorney, who knew all kinds of general law, he was flummoxed, stymied, wound up in certain blind alleys and corners, because he didn't know the rules, the bureaucratic rules, such as they were. Anyway, sorry for that digression.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's an issue, but I don't think I think what you need to do is you need to get a really tough attorney, because this is a game, and you want the other side to be frightened that to know that you have a highly competent, person who can go into a courtroom and knows how to conduct themselves. Right. And is not frightened of any of them. Mm-hmm. The idea, and in this particular milieu, that may be someone who's close to retirement, mm-hmm. who doesn't. Okay.
Yeah, right. I agree with that. I was just kind of worrying on your behalf whether the state of Maine is a big enough place to have, such as that, the likes of, because, state bars are such that you have to be approved within that state. And some of these things might be, in a sense, national issues. I mean, free speech and whatnot. A lot of the things you're talking about seem to me to be kind of kind of a federal issue in a way that supersede the states in some level. But I'm not a lawyer. So.
Anyway, so the case is moving on. I don't think the other side has a leg to stand on. I don't think they understand the case. I don't think, I think probably somewhere higher up at the federal level or minimally at the level of the governor's office, these people, these board staff who work for the governor and the Democratic administration were told to prosecute me and to push out the case so that the day after I was immediately suspended, I was in the national news. Right. And that's crazy because there wasn't even a case. I mean, what did they charge me with? Treating people legally.
Yeah, I mean,
haven't done anything wrong.
Yeah, there are no dead bodies. I mean, let's say, let's just go back to the kind of the virgin year of 2020. There's no vaccine out. And if you were to treat somebody with HCQ or ivermectin, they may or may not get better. We used to have a joke, you probably heard this, with the flu. If you treat the flu, it takes 7 days. If you leave it alone, it takes a week. I mean, there are some anti-influenza medicines now, so the joke's a little bit outdated, perhaps. But, we're downside, again, I think the data are not full on HCQ or ivermectin. I think ivermectin probably has a slightly higher chance of actually working, as it were. And there are more studies on it. But what are the downsides? You gave an antibiotic, as it were, of a sort to somebody, and it either did or didn't. I mean, if we got rid of doctors who did that, I mean, literally there would be no treating primary care physicians in the United States, because I think every single one of them has written a penicillin or antibiotic for the cold. So doctors have written antibiotics for viral illnesses, knowing that they're not going to do anything, which is frankly a step below what you were doing, which is writing for something when there was no other treatment and there was a possibility of doing good.
Yeah, so there's actually quite extensive literature on the benefits of hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin in not only COVID virus, but for certain other viruses. And both of these rather interesting drugs, if you go to clinicaltrials.gov and look them up, they are being tested for efficacy against a wide variety, including cancers, pregnancy loss, all sorts of things.
Yeah.
So,
but that's for me. That's not even the point. Whether they work or not, don't work. I don't think necessarily invalidates your right to try, or the patient's.
No, but if there's evidence that they work and they're being withheld deliberately, there's malfeasance on the other side.
Yes, I agree. I think there's been government, malfeasance. I mean, the example I use is HIV. If people were still waiting for, a vaccine for HIV now 40x, whatever it is, years after, they'd still be waiting. Treatment is okay for the HIV, the virus itself, and nobody's waiting for vaccine anymore. So treatment works for viruses. And in this case, it's life-saving. And there's no reason to think that they're necessarily inimical to each other. If a vaccine came along for HIV, wonderful. But that wouldn't necessarily negate the medications were there, or vice versa. So, medicine's never been either or. A lot of times it's figuring out what you have, what's the right situation. This might be right for you. This might not be right for you. So it sounds to me like this is more of a political, I might be reading too much in. Is it a political case or is it a medical case?
Well, I think it's a political case. I mean, there wasn't really an allegation that I harmed a patient. That's the thing, which is, the only thing you can immediately suspend a person for is gross negligence, raping a patient.
Yeah, danger to the public safety and welfare.
Multiple patients, that sort of thing. And yet I was immediately suspended when the patients that I treated, got better.
Right. Now, did you have an active patient clientele at the time?
Yeah. I mean, I had to shut down my office, one day when I was treating, I don't know, maybe 15 COVID patients a day.
Wow. So they're taking, they're taking a good solid player out of the lineup.
Yes. The two doctors in Maine were both taken out. Who were the only two of us who were openly using ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, both had immediate suspensions.
Wow. So I assume you two have been in contact?
Yeah.
Well, so what are your general thoughts on this? I mean, I don't want to carry on too much in this vein, but I find it like, hugely reprehensible, egregious, and way above beyond the call of duty and/or the mandates of the board. What, do you know anything about the history of the board, whether they've done things like this, and what was the original reason to have a board of registration in medicine in Maine?
Well, it has a mission statement. I mean, these people are paid by the state, and they are supposed to protect the patients of Maine from dangerous doctors. And that's a reasonable thing for them to do. I support that. But in my case anyway, they were actually preventing the patients of Maine from getting the treatments they sought for COVID.
Right.
And that has to be political. I mean, I've written long articles about the suppression of hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin and the many methods that were used to do that. For hydroxychloroquine, I have a list of 55 different mechanisms that were used around the world to suppress the use of the drug in many countries, using pharmacy company, manufacturers, chain drugstores, the number 2 maker of the active pharmaceutical ingredient, hydroxychloroquine, exploded in December of 2020 in Taiwan. France took the drug, hydroxychloroquine, which had been over the counter, and in October of 2019 began efforts to make it a prescription drug. And it became a prescription drug at the beginning of COVID. And then the entire supply that the government was in a warehouse in France disappeared. So there have been, enormous efforts throughout the world to stop people obtaining these drugs for COVID. And
what do you think the reason is?
Is that the powers that be wanted the pandemic to continue. Had everyone received effective early treatment, the pandemic would have been over. We would not have had to lock down. We would not have had to close schools. So many people would not have died, and it would have ended.
What's the rationale? So what do you think, giving their best intentions? What do you think is their rationale?
Rules.
I'm sorry, I'm speaking over you. I apologize.
So the powers that be want the emergency to continue because that gives certain public officials, governors, and health department officers, the head of the Department of Health and Human Services, a lot of authority to make decisions. So as you know, the CDC said people who weren't paying their rent couldn't be thrown out of their homes based on what they claimed were their emergency authorizations. The EUAs require an emergency to be declared by the Secretary of Health and Human Services. There could be no EUAs. Well, every COVID vaccine in the United States is being administered under an EUA.
Exactly. So my own pet theory is all of the above. And in addition, I think there's ultimately we're going to see, if they're not already there, a kickback cycle and circle from pharmaceutical companies that hugely benefit and continue to benefit from production of vaccine to officials entrenched who allow that to continue. The EUA is really the rationale for still trotting out a SARS-CoV-2 vaccine when SARS-CoV-2 is long gone and never to return to Earth unless re-released from some laboratory a decade hence or whatever. But there's mixing in Omicron at this point is just kind of window dressing. But it's kind of a cycle where the pharmaceuticals get to kind of clear inventory as long as it's under the EUA. The EUA is a necessary and completely is the backbone of continued production of an antiquated vaccine and selling it and enforcing it through various governmental organizations, military, and so forth, as having a need, as long as it's an emergency. I think a little bit of it's like the Wizard of Oz. once you realize there's no emergency, there is no emergency. The Cowardly Lion did have courage. We don't have an emergency, and needs somebody, the wizard needs to come out from behind the green curtain and announce that, so everyone can kind of have the realization that we are in the age of Omicron, the common cold, not Omicron, the continued variant kind of parade.
Right. And the reason why the EUA is so important is because it gives practically a total liability shield to not only the manufacturers, but to the government officials who order the programs, and as well as to the doctors and everybody else involved. So no one has any liability. So it allows the government a free hand to do whatever it wants. And as long as you went into a hospital and got an EUA product, you can't sue the hospital. It's just a big mess. It's a handover of authority to the medical system, to Fauci, to Rochelle.
Yeah, it's a centralization. The other thing that kind of what's the polite word for stinks? Lens odor. The thing that I grew up kind of as a classic liberal, and I'm not sure they exist per se currently, but I spent a lot of time reading New York Review of Books, and familiar with the case of Natan Sharansky, the Soviet, and others who said the truth, and they were institutionalized literally in psychiatric hospitals. So that this call, the boards, I think, use this as a cudgel that you are to get a neuropsych eval, to prove you're sane before you can even defend yourself. I think things should be based on the merits and the actual facts. There's, I think this kind of like, oh, you're not sane, it is a way of undercutting people, and it's really, frankly, it's an insult in and of itself that if somebody looks up your name, state of Maine, the first thing shows up for me anyway was that the state of Maine requests neuropsych eval on Dr. Nass.
Right.
It's not really arguing your points. It's like, oh, we can't even get to arguing her points because we don't know she's not crazy. Wherein I think that your general record, I assume you stop at red lights and you're kind to strangers, that kind of stuff. And here you are, been practicing for decades and decades. You have an education. You've hewed to the line enough that you maintain a household, you pay your taxes and all that kind of stuff. And yet you have to show you're not crazy before you can defend yourself. I mean, I find that so insulting.
Yes, exactly. Well, that's why I was in the national news. I mean, Newsweek, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Miami Herald, all ran stories about me, hit pieces, because
hit piece, they weren't on your side.
Yeah, the information the board released implied, because they had part of the statute in their releases, implied I'm either crazy or a substance abuser.
Right. Well, I'm high on life. But I understand all this. Again, I don't want to. It's not the me hour here, but it's a matter of record that I was suspended, and then I was unsuspended, and then resuspended very promptly on a total kind of, I can't use the word fabrication, but kind of a cotton candy puffed up kind of thing, which fell apart very briefly. And I've got my own kind of litigation, counter litigation against the board. And I don't know how far it's going to go. These things are tough to do. The board is a policing authority, and we, the state and our laws give a lot of latitude for the board or various boards to do their work as policing. But there is a concept in law called ultra vires or ultra vires, depending whether how Latin you want to get, which is acting outside of their strength, acting outside of their authority, and whether boards can do this. I mean, it seems to me this is a case of ultra vires where the board is taking on basically a Soviet language policing function rather than it's ascribed medical observation of physicians, danger in actual treatment to actual patients.
Right, exactly. And it's interesting because as you watched how the board works, basically they're a bunch of yes men. They make all their decisions unanimously. Mm-hmm. And, in my case, they presented a little story about me, which had nothing to do with what happened or didn't represent me properly. They made a lot of mistakes. And then they all voted unanimously, yeah, immediately suspend her, why not? And I think they felt they they working for the state, they had a liability shield that nothing could happen to them.
Right.
So it was okay for them to do that. And when you look at the advisory committees of the FDA and the CDC, you see them doing the same thing. They're given a little bit of information, and then they vote to approve a vaccine or authorize or whatever. Sorry, it's my other phone. And they don't know, they don't really have the evidence, but they do it anyway because,
Right.
they're yes men.
Yeah,
And
not just sadness. I mean, the Nuremberg trials and the Eichmann case and all this kind of stuff. It's Godwin's law that you lose an argument by mentioning Hitler first. But I'm willing to put this out that this is oftentimes the very same kind of excuse. It's like, oh, I'm just following orders. I'm just doing this. I find it reprehensible and cowardly that I assume the board is at least mostly physicians are not able to stand up for patients and for the right to for the art of medicine, for people to kind of take a different take on treatment without any substantial risk to the patients.
I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. I was just saying that it's oftentimes I think it's a bit of cowardice to think that you're just kind of going along and following orders when in fact you're the Board of Registration Medicine with your own medical degrees and so forth, and you're taking away the essence of medicine itself, which is the art of medicine, the ability to look at a patient, treat it, treat that person according to your best methodology, as long as we're not doing harm. And I find this is a big divorce of the medical boards to act as if they are policing political police, PC police.
So what's really going on is that the government is trying to take over medicine. So they're trying to destroy what's left of the doctor-patient relationship, the autonomy of patients and doctors to choose their own care. And you can see this right now in California, where the Assembly, both houses, voted in favor of a law to criminalize doctors' speech if it goes against the narrative. So if a doctor, whatever they constitute as misinformation, which they've clearly, nobody was willing to define it because they can't, but in California, if a doctor does what I did and spreads misinformation about COVID, they could lose their license. And so that the California has voted in favor, and it's sitting on Gavin Newsom's desk. And the question is whether he will be brave and bold enough to sign it.
I think he sees brave and bold as the opposite direction from what you might.
So yeah. Anyway, it could go either way. But what is desired by current, political leaders in the United States is for some federal agency. In the case of COVID, it was the NIH, but it's never been the NIH before. It was always the CDC. Roll out a treatment recommendation, and all doctors will have to use that single treatment on their patients, just as the CDC has already done for vaccines by removing medical exemptions and trying to remove religious and philosophic exemptions. So everybody is supposed to get the vaccines they want us to have, and everybody is going to get only the treatments they specify, which is, of course, remdesivir, number one, for COVID. And if we want that kind of world, which basically ends what we know of as medical care in the United States, then, don't stand up against it. But I will stand up against it, while I continue to breathe. That, they're not going to destroy my profession and the ability of patients to get the care they need. That will not.
That's a genuine profile and courage. I applaud your bravery. Is there a place where people can help you?
Yes. So, well, if you want to donate to my defense, donate to Children's Health Defense, which is helping me, and say it's for my defense. I have a Substack, merylnass.substack.com, and I have a blog, anthraxvaccine.blogspot.com, because I'm an expert on anthrax and anthrax vaccines. And, I'm out there. You can read my articles in The Defender and Epoch Times and Mercola.com. Each ran an important article I wrote over the week. They both ran it over the weekend about the new bivalent booster vaccines, which have nothing at all to recommend them.
Well, I agree with that. I have an article. I'm not going to announce where it's coming out, but it's coming out soon, I believe. Um, it's the working title is Corona 22, and it's my fervent desire to rename COVID-19. I think COVID-19 exists. It was real, like there was SARS-CoV-2, but it's long gone. And what is around right now is Omicron, which is not genetically, um, ancestrally related to COVID-19 or the alpha, beta, delta, the Greek letter, wave variants. It's a coronavirus. If you went to a textbook in 2017, and you can still find them, they're out on the shelves, and looked up coronavirus, it'd say the second leading cause of the common cold, and by type. And I think it constitutes only maybe 14 to 20%, but there are a lot of other causes. So it's kind of in second in the plurality race. If we were running for Congress in Alaska, it would make the runoffs. Anyway, so Omicron much more likely is just one of those common colds. And since we're testing for coronavirus all the time now, we find some of the old pre-existing common cold type coronaviruses, such as Omicron. Anyway, cut to the chase. The new bivalent vaccine has two ingredients. It's basically going to produce spike protein for the one that you can't get anymore because everyone's immune, it's gone, and it's going to produce those for basically the common cold for which we would never get vaccines. So one is for a virus that's harmless, and the other one is for a spike protein that's useless. So they combine useless and harmless together in a great new thing that's covered by the EUA, so it doesn't need to go through full vaccine trials. And if there are side effects, again, it's for something that's completely pointless and outdated mixed in with something that's harmless and useless. For a virus.
Humans.
Say it again.
Never tested in humans.
Exactly, and that's under the EUA. So, the fact that the reason for the name change point of the article is that if we started calling Omicron what it really is, which was Corona 21 initially in December, and now Corona 22, we would stop calling it COVID-19. We could call it common cold, corona, whatever. Common corona, so give it some other name that's not COVID-19. We would be able to put COVID-19 to rest and get away from the EUA, because there's no emergency and that COVID-19 is gone. So that's kind of my declaratory, kind of speech oriented. I think as we define things tends to be how we act upon them. Anyway, that's my 2 cents on the matter. I want to applaud you for your courage. I think it can't be easy to have your practice kind of dissolve away. These things are my own particular case. I had a practice in Revere near the airport, 27 years, and I owned and ran it, and I was the guy there. And one of my kind of sarcastic long-term buddies said I was the best veterinarian on Broadway, but he was joking. But I had a nice coterie of patients, and treated the firemen and the policemen and everybody up and down the street, and thousands of patients over the years, or tens of thousands, so forth. But one day that was just boom, gone, because they had an idea for temporary suspension. The temporary suspension, in my case, went on for 5 years because I fought and fought and fought. I never acceded to or admitted to things that they said. They wanted me to apologize for things. They would tell me, they said initially I could have kept my license if I admitted never to do something, but that was something I'd never done in the first place. And I'm just not, I would rather literally drive a taxi than admit to, false truth, as it were, if that's not an oxymoron. Anyway, it's been for my case, a tough, long battle. So I appreciate, kind of the loss of your practice. I had horrible dreams about it for a long, long time, but I didn't lose sleep over maintaining, doing what I thought was right. So I hope that strength and power continues in and through you. And I hope others learn from your example that you can live and breathe, by doing the right thing, and maybe hopefully treat even more people, and more people get the message than perhaps in your own small practice, as it were.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
So can I ask you just a side question before we leave? It's just what are those patients doing? Do they have hopes of seeing Dr. Nass again in that capacity?
Well, a lot of people didn't get treated for COVID because of what they did to me and to this other doctor. So that can never be made good. I lost my license and it was a suspension. So I still haven't had a hearing. I get a hearing in 3 weeks.
That's
What
back from January.
From January. So I'll get a hearing now, but they only have 2 days a month. They will hold hearings,
Right.
and so it will probably take 3 months or more to get through my hearing. And
That's
you know,
right.
get
So in
my
Massachusetts, they have an immediate hearing, and then they give you a 7-day emergency appeal. There's not that. I mean, in our case, it didn't take 7 days. More like 3 weeks, 3 months, and then 11 months. So it didn't actually happen. But they have a statute that you're supposed to have some kind of timely justice. I forget which amendment that is.
They're supposed to give you a hearing in 30 days, but because my first lawyer quit, then I had to find another lawyer.
Oh, I see.
Okay.
Right.
And my second lawyer quit, and so then I had to find another lawyer, and that lawyer said he would need months to prepare.
Right.
So anyway, here we are.
All right. Fair enough. Well, do you have any questions or parting thoughts for me or for the audience?
So this isn't just me. I mean, this has happened to hundreds and hundreds of doctors throughout the United States, have been threatened. Very few of them have been immediately suspended. I think my board was a little bolder. You see, what they do is they pick on people they think are not going to give them trouble. And so I was 70, and it costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to fight them.
Right.
And they figured, she's 70 years old, she'll just retire, and that'll be the end of it. And they didn't expect that I would have the help of Children's Health Defense and Bobby Kennedy, and that I would fight them back. That was not part of their, calculation.
Right.
Yeah.
So is this Janet Mills doing? Do I have her name right?
Yes, you do. So she is just a Democratic tool, and the head of the Department of Health and Human Services in Maine is a Mainer, but she was sent to Washington. She cut her teeth on all this, bullshit within the federal bureaucracy, and now she's back here to impose that on it. She's a funny woman. She talks. She sounds like a baby when she talks. She seems so timid, and yet she knows she's a good tool. She does what she's supposed to. So anyway,
it sounds like some other people might need neuropsych evaluations, but probably not you. So I'm going to conclude my neuropsych evaluation of you because it's thorough and professional, and to say that I found this a delight. I appreciate your intellect and your endeavor, and I again wish you continued courage, and thank you so much. Don't step off yet. I'm just going to end the video. You can say goodbye to everybody out there. All right.
Okay.
So thank you very much for joining us. Please share this video. I think it's very important, if you're out there watching this, that you share and promote this video. And please help support Dr. Meryl Nass. Have a great day.